The year is 1994, based on the comic by James O'Barr. The night before his wedding, musician Eric Draven, played by the late Brandon Lee, and his fiancée are brutally murdered by members of a violent inner-city gang. On the anniversary of their death, Eric rises from the grave and assumes the gothic mantle of the Crow. Draven tracks down the thugs responsible for the brutal murder of the love of his life and delivering his justice. He finds light of hope in society from a conflicted cop, Sergeant Albrecht, played by Ernie Hudson, and little girl Sarah, played by Rochelle Davis. This week on Back to the Balcony, we cover the tragic dark superhero movie with a tragic history in 1994's The Crow.
Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert, two titans of cinematic review. Sometimes right, sometimes wrong, but always captivating. Your hosts Antonio of the Cult-Worthy Cinema Podcast and Justin Henson of the Movie Wire are here to take you back to the balcony.
So I gotta say, man, this one I wasn't a fan of in the 90s. This one wasn't the superhero movie for me. And given the history and learning more on what I do with the film going process, a respect grew for this. And I haven't taken a look at this movie for a few years. And the rewatch was a completely different experience for me. Is after superhero movie of the same generic tone, the CGI, this one to me was almost a breath air when I'm looking at the world this creates. And you tap that with a lot of the respect from not only the tragic accident on the set of The Crow of production hell that turned into almost a salute to Brandon Lee. This one is production hell that went into something of a bright light in filmmaking that actually set the tone for a lot of movies in the future. And it was almost an emotional experience for me watching this movie again.
Yeah, I've got a very strong connection to this movie. I was 13 when it came out. I saw it in the theater, and me being a tiny bit older than you, this was like literally for my generation and above. I mean, the goth movement was in. We finally got our own superhero. I mean, I wasn't a goth, but the genre and that lifestyle fascinated me as a teenager in junior high school, like when this thing came out. And also, the soundtrack was extremely relevant too. So I think it really is a better first time watch and better appreciated film nostalgically for people, I'm going to say my age, so 1981 and above or below, I should say, because it really spoke to us. Because people that are younger than me, it took them years to appreciate it because it just didn't have that cultural relevance when they were of age when the film came out. But then, like, you get older, you get into darker things, and you get less away from like the bubblegum popcorn of a lot of superhero movies. You do see the beauty and the tragedy of it, and that's what makes it special. And I'm not going to even joke around with the fact that we have seen so many superhero movies really try to emulate the broodiness and the darkness that this film nailed perfectly. So you can't have the Matt Reeves Batman. You can't have some of the Nolan stuff either without Alex Proyas's visual stylings of this movie, 100%.
And it's a rare case that we have this music video director go into this movie, and you know while watching it, it looks like a music video, but there are elements here that really do spark the grittiness, the emotional element of it that really does kind of suck you in. And the most impressive piece to me, and our critics are going to talk about it, is not just the atmosphere that we create, but how the direction utilizes it, how many swoop shots we get to really take us into this, to really engage us into this environment. It's one of those that we've talked about before where this is a setting and atmosphere that really is a character of its own, that really does put us in the movie and puts us in this experience of this gothic tone. And it's just an overly spot on element to the superhero genre. And in the early 90s, we didn't get this kind. It was either fluffy, family, funny superhero movies, or they were just kind of trying to emulate the Batman grittiness of Tim Burton. So it was really nothing in between. And this is one that absolutely got it right.
And I can see why there are people that struggle with this movie because it does play on many different levels. They do talk about it in the review, where the art direction really is the king of this film. It is the driving force. We're going to talk about characters and Brandon Lee in a little bit, but the movie works because of its art direction and visual styles. And it's interesting too because like it's dark Gotham, right? And Gotham's already dark, but we're using miniatures and models and practical effects and a lot of fascinating work with lenses to produce different depths of field and focus. It's beautifully and it's articulate. The same year, though, I have to give some credit to the Coen brothers doing Hudsucker Proxy. They use a very similar style, but they make it, with the lights on. They do it outside. It's New York City. It's, 50s Art Deco, but they use a lot of the same kind of camera work, lenses, forced perspective, and these miniatures to create a 1950s New York skyscape. I just miss those days because now with CGI, you know what you're looking at. You know how they made it, and you know that this is just probably a file saved on someone's computer of New York skyline A or Detroit skyline B, right? But back in the day when these movies came out, what I loved about the art direction of these films is you knew you were looking at a city, but you had to question yourself on whether or not you were looking at a real city. We weren't used to CGI yet. So you're like, are these miniatures? Are these paintings? Why does this look real but not feel real? And it puts you in a mental and emotional state that the movie can play in that modern day cinema just can't perform with anymore.
You really can. And this is where the appreciation of the setting really did set in because a lot of studios didn't have the confidence in the actual superhero character. They didn't have the confidence that one person can drive it without the hero element. So these settings really had to be spot on. I mean, we look at The Shadow that came out the same year, The Phantom later. These are ones that utilized different, not in comparison to The Crow, a lot lighter and fluffier, but they still utilize these settings to really bring us into what we are interacting
Mhm.
with these characters. And these are ones that really did appreciate the supporting character. And when we get into the reviews, there is a lot of elements with Ebert that I'll get into, but these are the screenplays that really did not take the supporting cast for granted on delivering the message of the heroic gesture. And that's what again I appreciate about this one. We have the Crow character, but there's not a lot of personality to it. It doesn't drive the movie. These are ones that have a supporting cast that really gives that emotional element of hope that this hero is going to succeed and these supporting heroes are going to succeed. So you can't have a hero or a superhero movie without a heroic supporting cast.
I agree with you, but I can also understand why some people struggle with this movie because I'm going to say that in the sense of pacing and flow, it is a jumbled mess. But that's understandable because your lead star was tragically killed not even halfway through production, and they had to do a lot of trickery to make this movie work, and you can feel it in the flow. However, I think that what you just spoke to, the characters, the character actors in this movie, being able to play these roles so well and really create a harsh environment of villainy, right? These feel more dangerous than comic book movie characters. The stakes are higher. So those in the equation, as with the heavy metal and gothic and industrial music and this amazing soundtrack, the visuals and what we get of Brandon Lee's performance, they really did tie it in a perfect little package. And I think that Proyas knew and his editing team knew that the film was going to be a jumbled mess because of what they had to work with the surviving footage of Brandon Lee. So what do? Make the film more chaotic in its energy to cover up the fact that it is a jumbled mess. So I think that people that really understood that and wanted these characters and wanted this music and wanted this atmosphere, they gave that a pass because they worked it into the dynamic of the movie. While outsiders who don't appreciate this kind of genre are going to see where it falls apart at the seams because of what happened. So I think it's a movie for very two different audiences, and it's the way it's always been. There's an audience that absolutely loves it, and then there's the audience that's very critical of it, saying, "Oh, well, people only like that movie because it looks good, or people only like that movie because of the soundtrack, or it's only popular because Brandon Lee died while he was making it. If that wouldn't have happened, then it wouldn't have been famous." That's like saying that Nirvana wouldn't have been famous if Kurt Cobain hadn't died, right? Get out of here. That's just like hater speak. But I do understand the criticisms that do come out there.
Yeah, I can totally understand it too. And there's two different levels of me where I can see the flaws of this movie. Is it a perfect movie? Absolutely not, because the editing at times we can see the flaws and we can see a lot of the elements of spliced together pieces of it. And when it comes to, you spoke to stakes, the stakes to me, it isn't necessarily the stakes are higher, in my opinion. I think it's actually too close to home when it comes to where we are in this reality. We are in, again, the crime element where we have that fear of what happens on the streets after dark. We RoboCop did the same thing of the violence that can happen on the streets, the how society can turn, and we see a lot of the dangers what can happen in the city after dark. And to me, that is what really turns the stomach when it comes to the danger that our characters face. And even the Crow, right when from the get go, we get this brutal murder and we get this darkness to it, and then we experience that throughout the entire movie. The feeling of danger never goes away, and that's due in part to the smart direction and the atmosphere, but it's also a relatability of fear that we have as society of going out after dark in a big city. So I think this is a smart written screenplay to an extent where the descriptions of how we're feeling is really at par here with where these characters are going to go and where the story is going to go. So the screenplay isn't the greatest, but how it's described in the setting is 100%.
I think it also had the advantage of, the modern audience of this time of 1993. They really did not know the source material. It was real fanboy stuff, right? It wasn't even a really comic book. It was a graphic novel. And it was, very violent, highly sexualized, a lot of gore and a lot of supernatural additions to it. It wasn't what people on the wide spread of comic book fandom were into. So I can see how studios were really hesitant about making an R-rated comic book movie about a topic that only a niche group knew about, right? That's a very, very challenging thing for a studio to invest money in. To kind of get a little bit more of the clarity of why the film does feel the way it does, the original comic book and the original vision of this movie was a lot more gothic and supernatural. There were other supernatural entities in the movie that they cut for budgetary reasons, but also because the studio thought the audience wouldn't get it. Essentially, Eric Draven had like a ghost cowboy that was in the film that would show up now and then, almost be kind of like a mentor and guide him through like the underworld and what he was as this undead, vengeance guy. And it was too much, right? They didn't think audiences would get it. So again, that's another reason why the film does feel choppy, is because they did have a lot more in the story that they pulled out. And like, again, I feel so impressed that they did make a cohesive film out of all of that when it didn't happen, and then the tragedy of that star. So that's where I want to jump into these side characters, because we've talked about this before in many films where if you have a lead character, I mean, Brandon Lee is great athletically, stoically, he is perfect. The Crow is not supposed to be a Peter Parker with wisecracks, although he does have a few. You have to rely on the people that are on the villain side and on the protagonist side to move the story along so he can have an interesting path to its fruition, right? Otherwise, and they talk about it in the review, it's just a vengeance story. Kill, 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 kill. We spend so much time with the villains in this movie, and that's what I like about it. We spend so much time learning more about Michael Wincott's Top Dollar and all the weird perverted stuff that he's into with his half-sister played by Bai Ling. We spend a lot of time with David Patrick Kelly as T-Bird, who's like the main gang leader of this group of guys. Then, of course, we have the immortal Tony Todd, who's kind of like the consigliere to Top Dollar. We spend a lot of time with these villains and get to see what their lifestyles are like, which adds to the villainous atmosphere of this movie.
Well, I don't think audiences were ready for it at all because we talked about this last week. Is audiences were so timid on where we were on what's being delivered to us when it comes to culture. So this one, you take a guitar, dark setting, heavy metal, grunge. You put everything into a superhero movie that contradicts what society thought a superhero movie should be. And it's really going to put that question mark on what kind of movie you're going to watch or if you should even see it. And here's one that really would have been a shame. And I really did wish I saw this in the theater to experience it. But Brandon Lee's portrayal here is one that I actually did appreciate from the beginning, but I appreciated it more after my rewatch where I can see the innocence
Mhm.
to it. To me, I judged it way too soon, and I'll be open and honest with that. I judged it way too soon because the dialogue is simplistic. It is kind of generic when it comes to a superhero movie, but what Brandon Lee does with it is interesting. It is a focus of the rebirth. It's almost childlike. It's an innocence of almost gratefulness and childlike mentality of growing relationships. And we don't see that from a superhero movie. We would never see that from a superhero movie today because we don't want superheroes to be so innocent. We don't want them to have these soft spoken pieces of dialogue. We want this powerhouse of muscle and heroic activity. This is a man that really does have an internal conflict, and he is still vocalizing and being grateful for the relationships that he has of positivity. So there is a subtle underlying message that does go through all this darkness that I think stood out to me more than any other element or any other character of this movie. Is this would have been Brandon Lee's forte on his career because hands down, with not a completed movie, but I would have loved to see what would have been finished on where he would have taken this character because this would have been his movie.
I agree, and I try not to speculate on that because I've seen Brandon Lee's earlier works like Laser Blast and Showdown Little Tokyo. He's fine, he's charismatic, he's a good B movie leading man in those movies, but this was going to be the one, right? But it also would have peaked very high for him. What would films have looked like after? That's always been my biggest question is, this is an action film when we're in an era where we're still looking at our action stars as Schwarzenegger and Stallone, right? And Bruce Willis. So I don't know. I try not to speculate because I don't want to be negative about it. But this would have been the perfect film for him. And if it would have been a franchise, great. I think one of the things that makes this film, though, stand apart is that Brandon Lee's not trying to save anybody, right? The person that he cares about is already dead. So it is a revenge tale. So it's darker. It doesn't have the rewarding hero finale that a typical comic book movie would. I mean, there's a lot of self-sacrifice and personal sacrifice in it, but it doesn't have rescue the damsel. It doesn't have rescue, the city. Now he does try to rescue the little girl, who's a big part of it, but again, that's just bait for the script, right? That character is kind of useless. She kind of is the narrator, but she doesn't really do much for the story other than kind of show the humanity that he still has, that he's not all zombie Brandon Lee. Ernie Hudson as the cop. That's a great way to kind of show where we're based at in reality when he's, showing that he's dealing with a dick boss and the police station's overrun and it's really gang against cop in this town and he just wants to kind of be in the middle of it and get sucked into this mystery. That is a good way to, like I said, attach to the humanity of the movie. But other than that, it is a dark and ugly story, and that's why it does divide audiences. So if we're going to be predictive about what Brandon Lee's future would be like, would it be all nihilistic films like this? Because we really don't get to see any other tone from him than this serious nihilistic. But what he does do is he makes it believable and he makes it tragic and real. So I really appreciate that. On a side note, though, the person that filled in for him after he passed away, and they did the CG over his face and did a lot of long shots, it was a stuntman by the name of Chad Stileski. Chad Stileski went on to go choreograph all the fight scenes for Jason Statham movies in the early 2000s, and is now known as the guy that essentially brought us and still continues to bring us the John Wick films. So he is the man behind the Eric Draven mask after Brandon Lee passed away. I thought that was kind of a cool little thing, especially when you think that David Leitch, who directed the first John Wick with him, and then Deadpool 2 and Bullet Train, he was Keanu Reeves' stunt double in the Matrix movies. So you had the Crow and the Keanu Reeves Neo stunt doubles directing a movie together. And I just think that's kind of cool that those two guys kind of started small as stunt dudes and now are two of the biggest directors in the industry.
I love that fact. And honestly, if I were to speculate, I know you're not a speculate kind of guy, but at the same time, I really would have hoped that that wouldn't have gone the route of Mr. Action Star because there's more
Yeah.
here that would have been with Brandon Lee. But when we take the Sarah, and this is where I'm going to push back on you a little bit, because when we take the character of Sarah and Sergeant Albrecht here, is these two characters, especially with Sarah, as we talk about the innocence, this is one where we take that one scene where we have him give that lecture to the mom, that very harsh lecture about drugs. And this is a character that matches his tone, the Sarah character of the childlike innocence. And then we have Ernie Hudson come in as a harsh bit of reality, but really does have that stern characteristic, but understanding, almost like a father figure. So, with between these two characters, they counteract each other very well on almost these two characters coming to terms with this one individualized character that has the violence as we see with Ernie Hudson. We have the innocence as we see with the child. So to me, I think these two really create and support. This is a pure definition of a supporting cast where we really lift up this hero to talk to his personality, not his superpowers, but his personality of what complements the superpower. So to me, I think it's a little bit deeper, and whether that's intentional or not, or it's just my interpretation, but I think that is smart writing when it comes to these new writers coming at this script, to really have that supporting aspect of what develops a hero by the end of the
I
climax.
agree. And, we really have no idea how dark this movie would have been had it been in its original state. We have no idea how nihilistic or tragic or even more violent it would be. I think with what they came up with all that was said and done, is really like a perfect movie for its time. And it's a movie that's going to be talked about and emulated for the rest of, for the rest of existence, as long as people are making movies. It's really hard to say that a movie looked like The Crow before The Crow came out. They make some comparisons. I'm going to fight back a little bit with them once we get to that spot. But we've seen lots of movies try to be The Crow since that. And I think that is like its main stamp on its legacy. Okay, so, it's an interesting review that these guys bring because we've had conversations like this before where one's really on board and the other isn't. And it's just really fascinating to me that one critic really fights against stuff like this when I think in his heart of hearts, he knows it's more than just a simple revenge flick. But before we get into our conversation, let's hear what they had to say. This was Roger's movie to bring to the episode.
Brandon Lee plays the Crow in that scene, a murdered rock musician who comes back to life and vows revenge against the evil mastermind behind a gang of thugs who killed him and his fiancée on the eve of their wedding. Well, as everybody knows, Brandon Lee himself was accidentally shot dead during the filming of The Crow when a prop gun mistakenly had a lethal charge in it. And that adds a special poignance to this movie because not only does the story ironically mirror real life, but Lee is so good here and the movie is so good that this could easily have been the beginning of a starring career for him.
Yeah, I agree. And that's probably one of the most tragic parts about the movie. And just because that's how it starts off in this review, it kind of feeds to my point earlier where I feel that there's a lot of people who think that this movie only has a legacy because of the tragedy. But I don't. I think that he would have definitely had at least an action career. But you can tell just by the way that Roger starts off this critique that he enjoyed the movie. And he doubles down on that even more. But yeah, I'm glad it was him that brought the film to the episode because when we find out what our other critic says, it would have been a very different energy in the conversation.
I love the fact that he brought it to this episode too, because Roger, I've always had a great appreciation for the outlook and the reviews of superhero movies because I agree with a lot of them, not all, but a lot of them, because he appreciates the elements, just not with one singular character, but also the elements that really add on to the character. So he is the
Mhm.
perfect man to critique a superhero movie. Gene, not so much. So there is a lot of things that he just said that we've kind of just touched on, but he's absolutely right in just the beginning review of Brandon Lee. What I love about his journalism here is that he really did touch on the tragedy first and overall just what could have been. And I know we talk about speculation here, but the examples he gives in the short amount of screen time that he has really does, it's hard to avoid that conversation because it was so bright and full of potential. So it's really hard to talk about The Crow, not necessarily if it's good or bad, but what Brandon Lee could have done after The Crow.
Well, and also Roger was so much more adaptable as cinema was progressing and changing, especially in the 90s, because we've recovered enough movies in the 80s that they didn't like. They really didn't like the decade for the most part. There were some winners in there, but for the most part, they thought 80s was like a bad decade for cinema. And then in the early 90s, they were still kind of feeling that way. And then it was right around this time, like 93 to 95, where their opinions really started to change. They started to catch up with the new decade. We talked about it with Pulp Fiction. We talked about it with Man Without a Face and all the blockbusters that came out in that summer of 93. Now, this is a new kind of superhero movie. This is a new kind of comic book graphic novel adaptation that people were going to really, see what could be done with this medium. And Roger was for it. He was adaptable to change, and you could tell that he liked it. He even compliments the heavy metal music later. It's the fact that his partner did not adapt to decades at all. Like even up until like the time where he was passing, we watched some of his critiques, and he still had this old archaic sense of cinematic pride where if it's not like the films in the 70s, then I don't like it. He was a little bit adaptable for some genres and some weirdly weird picks that we've talked about in the past, but for the most part, he did not like to see the change. And that's what made these episodes of Siskel and Ebert in the 90s, I think, so caustic and argumentative between the two of them, is because you could tell one of these critics was really adapting with the times, and the other one was like putting his heels in the dirt and not going along with the progress that movies were going.
Well, and even more so, when it comes to this kind of genre, when it comes to superhero movies, it was, again, we get old Gene where it's, I want it this way, either really, really
Right.
fluffy or really, really focus on a singular character and make it heroic. Roger looks holistically, and we've seen that we'll
Yeah.
get into in a second.
What's special about the film is its look, its style, and its energy. Director Alex Proyas has put together sort of a cross between Blade Runner and Batman, but darker, grungier, and more threatening than either one of those pictures. And Brandon Lee, in his last performance, shows here that he clearly had the potential to become a major action star.
Yeah, so the look of it, he recognizes it. I think Blade Runner is a very interesting comparison because it's not futuristic. If anything, it's like retro future, right? Like everything's burnt down and backwards, and the cars are all vintage and old, right? They're muscle cars. I like that. It almost feels post-apocalyptic, but it's not. It's a city under siege and chaos of these gang members, right? And it's Detroit, so that makes even more sense with the time. A collapsing city, a collapsing economy where crime is running rampant. But the visualization of these miniatures, I feel it does look more like Batman. I feel it does look more like what the Coens did with Darkman, right? It feels a little bit more kinetic, a little more frenetic. It's got a little bit more action, some jitteriness to it, but also it's rough around the edges, and that's what makes it work so well with this particular story. Is this is a story about the main hero being dead, but the city and the environment are essentially dead as well.
Roger wants us to go on the atmosphere. He wants us to go on the environment. He wants to suck us into Gotham City to uh, all these worlds. We saw it with Ninja Turtles. He complimented the setting of it. Batman, he complimented the setting of it. Dark City by Proyas, also huge fan of that. But even Darkman, he's a fan of setting the tone because the hero's only good on the city that he's protecting. And Roger knows that. And that's what he really does appreciate. And every review that we kind of have covered so far or we've discussed Roger talks the setting and he talks the atmosphere and he gives credit where credit's due because you have to have that to engage the audience. And this is an engaging movie to an extent. First half, not so much for me. Second half, absolutely. When it comes to setting that tone, because that's where we really get that engagement from the camera angles and the camera shots. And again, we've talked about that could be forced because of editing and whatever it may be. But that's where we really get an appreciation for this environment. And here it does actually work.
I love that you said the hero being like the reflection of his environment because that is so true. I think that that's one of the things that a lot of the superhero movies make the mistake of is that their hero is not well conceived in the environment that he's acting. So, for example, Spider-Man in the Sam Raimi movies is perfect for the environment they put him in. Even in the third one, which isn't so great, it feels right, right? But then I feel like as the MCU's moved on, I feel like you've got the group of people who are creating the sets and the environments and the world that this movie's going to exist in. And then you got the group that's actually handling the character and the character design. And they don't feel symbiotic with each other. Like they don't feel like they belong in the same movie. And this is the perfect example of the hero and the character matching his environment and being a representation of his environment. The world is dark, it's dirty, it's grungy, and it's dying. And so your hero is going to be brooding, in leather, torn, disheveled. That works. It feels right. So it's not just about the set design and the art, the art design of the film and the background of the settings. It's also the character and what you're bringing to it aesthetically and with performance. That is something that I think that a lot of people don't recognize is that these two parts of this movie operate so well with each other, and that's what makes it work.
Well, we take a look at even so much as going forward to phase one of Marvel. He gave Iron Man 4 stars. He gave Thor 1.5 stars. These are an indicator that he does really look for the character and the settings first. And not only that, but the supporting characters. Thor, we didn't get that. It was just a guy they did nothing with that character. But we look at even going back in the 90s to, I think it's 96 with the Phantom, where it did have that unique environment. It did have that serial commercial radio land feel to it. So there is an importance to just keeping the environment and the characters all interesting. Spider-Man 1, they hated. Spider-Man 2, they loved because the characters, that hero element, they actually attacked with characters that we did care about, not just our hero that they put a cape on and said, like it.
Yeah. And the fact that this is kind of roughly an origin story in its own, but they make it so quickly that you don't have to feel like you're being dragged through this guy's whole life story. They really rush you into it, and I'm fine with that. Normally, I'm not big on, we're just going to rush through this just so we can get to the story, but in this movie, it works. Anyway, our boy Gene did not like this film at all.
Well, I don't compare this film favorably to either Blade Runner or Batman. I don't think it's as good as either one of those. And I think it does borrow from Blade Runner in particular, the physical look. And that, I think Blade Runner probably is going to go down in history as one of the most influential art-directed pictures of all time. And I do think that the story is, as you described it, straightforward revenge fantasy. What I do like the comic book camera angles. I do like him. I think he is charismatic, but I can't recommend the picture because the story bored me so much, Roger.
Well, Gene, comic books have stories like this, and I think that this is a very daring attempt to film a comic book.
Yeah.
I think that the whole movie is a piece. For example, all the heavy metal music on the soundtrack is very effective. The look of the film is sensational when the camera is flying over that city, which is made out of miniatures.
For example, I thought that the stories in both the pictures you named were more complicated. Both Batman, another comic book story, and also Blade Runner
story was so complicated that even after the director's cut came out, nobody was able to explain it. That isn't
No,
That
no.
isn't the point here, Gene.
No,
This movie is an
you're
experience. It's not a
Yeah.
story. All these stories are made
Well, then
up
why
anyway.
why did you describe it as a straightforward revenge fan? I'm using your own words because you
I
know
was
that the story
describing
is
it.
not.
I wasn't criticizing it. I was describing it
I'm
as
criticizing it because with
Okay.
all of the good looks in the picture, it got very
So
repetitive
you
for
go
me.
to see a movie like The Crow in order to have a nice, subtle
No, I go
storyline,
to
right?
see a movie like The Crow have some complication of the story so that all that I don't see is the rain, and the visual look of the picture.
Okay, well, I saw more.
I love it when they do that. Yeah, so I think that at the end of the day, Gene is only looking at the surface level of it like he always does. And we've said this before, like sometimes he really wants to focus on the story and sometimes he really wants to focus on what the production is. And on this one, he was so, I guess, hypnotized by the production and the raininess that he did not pay attention to the character dynamics, to the performances, to, the story, which it is a revenge-o-matic, but it is done in a very unique way. If it was such a stereotypical traditional revenge-o-matic film like a Death Wish, right? Then it wouldn't be as iconic as it is now. Roger saw the future and what it meant for production and what it meant for the culture, and Gene just saw a revenge film with a lot of rain.
Well, Roger says the key word here, which is experience, because I would have love to see Roger and buddy pal Martin Scorsese when he landed that Marvel's the theme park ride. In a way, he's right. But I would have loved to see the conversation between that point, because even here in the early 90s, Roger sees it. These movies are experiences. That's what they are. And it is okay to separate the two. You have those that go to movies for the experience, for the theme park ride, for the entertainment value. And if that's the filmmaker's intent, that's fine. But then you do have ones that challenge the mind. And what Gene's trying to do here is have it all in one. Not everything has to challenge the mind. People go and buy a ticket not to be challenged all the time. Sometimes they just need an escape. Here, we do get a little bit of both. And with this one, it does take a little bit of time to really appreciate what the movie's trying to do. And whether that's intentional or not, that's still open for debate. But this is an experience because it's something new that it does with the genre. It's something new that they try. And it is needed to be appreciated for the evolution of film during this time to really amplify where film's going to go. And I'm glad a critic saw through that and it was challenged that this is a unique film that is an experience because of its a uniqueness. Roger, I can bet, doesn't love heavy metal. I hate heavy metal, but I love the integration of the heavy metal into this movie. And that's how you know that it's working. It's a success because it actually adds to the value of the film.
Well, and again, I think that's where Roger really appreciates the creativity behind the filmmaker and the team. Where if this had Danny Elfman music over it, then it would just feel like Batman, right? Instead, it has this hard industrial metal music and a lot of tricky camera angles and a lot of violence. It's so visceral. It's what makes it unique. And Roger can see that and appreciate that. But what it does do, man, is it goes back to my original point of where this movie is very divisive for different audiences. And Gene just happened to be on that side where he just didn't get it. It didn't speak to him. Therefore, he's looking at it at the most rudimentary way possible, separating the story from the visuals and liking a little bit of both, but not being able to recommend it because together they just don't mix well in his head. And I can't blame him too much for that because I know lots of people that feel the same way about this movie. It is just one of those movies that's very divisive. It's got its lovers and it's got its haters, and it's got people who are just like, meh, they could care less about it one way or another. So I have to say that I am not 100% upset at him for how he feels about this movie. Where I do get upset is when he doesn't have a good argument when he doesn't have a good argument when Roger is really bringing facts to the table, because then he just trips over his words and he looks incompetent and he looks unprofessional. It happens a lot, but this one, it really does speak through where he did not come to this conversation prepared to back up his argument with other than the fact that it's a rudimentary revenge story with a lot of rain and dark visuals. There's more to it than that. He knows that, but because he didn't like it for what it was, he should have just let Roger speak and then finish the review. He didn't have to keep going. That's the frustrating part for me.
It didn't connect with them, and I get that. Again, you're 100% right. Not everything's going to connect with audiences, especially one that goes really hard to the dark, gritty visuals. But what really does drive me crazy is the mere point that Gene made was it wasn't complex enough. It wasn't um,
No.
it didn't challenge the mind, if you will. So that's where it does drive me a little bit nuts because we go off of that assumption that a movie like this needs to challenge. And it almost goes into a lot of his other reviews at this time during this kind of era, where if it has heavy metal music, if it has this violence in it, it is absolutely horrible. It shouldn't be made. And it really does taint what filmmakers are trying to do. So to me, it was more of the society piece of him pushing that opinion. He couldn't explain why he liked it because this movie's intent is from the beginning. It's not there to make you critically think, it's there to entertain and give you that experience. It is a violent revenge story, but it has visuals and music to really take it up a level. So there the expectation is set right from the beginning of what this movie is going to be. So critically think, I don't think that should even be on the table as an argument because it's a superhero movie that's dark, full of heavy metal, and it rains a lot. So this isn't a movie to make you think.
I think too that he really only appreciates like heavy violence and dark material and dark subject matter when it's played for satire. That's why he loved RoboCop so much because he could say, "Oh, well look, they're talking satirically about the violent state of the world and war and nuclear bombs and technology and corporations, yet there's like a tongue-in-cheek attitude to it." That is the way I feel like he can really make sense of films that are darker and more aggressive, is if they have a satirical punch to it. Where this has none of that. I mean, there's barely any comedy in it. And when there is comedy, it's usually like a leading up to a very violent scene or conclusion, right? Especially with the villains. Like the villains have clever one liners before they samurai sword somebody, right? It's one of those kind of movies. And he just isn't like that. He doesn't like the ugliness of that. He likes his dark material and subject matter with a touch of satire or political winks and nods that can say, hey, everyone, we're in on the joke. It's almost like fourth wall breaking, and that's what entertains him in those movies. He's not one for brooding pictures, and this is a very brooding picture, but Roger sees it, and that's why Roger did love Dark City so much. I mean, Dark City doubles down on the darkness that this one portrays, and Roger was here for it. We already talked about it in that If They Won the Oscars episode. So yeah, I think that at the end of the day, two critics, two different points of view, one likes it, one doesn't, and it just perfectly reflects, I think, where this movie sits with people in, the movie going world. There's people that love it like we do, and there's people who just don't understand why people like it.
100%. And I think if they maybe played cartoon music through The Crow, I'm sure Gene would probably have given it 3 stars. But, it's one of those. And I'm praising it up and down. Is it a perfect movie? No. Is it a good movie? It's a good experience. And that is the key word of what makes it good, the experience aspect of it, because there is a level of appreciation for those that love researching the filmmaking process and seeing the little nuggets that go into how this movie was a miracle. It got pushed to theaters and finished. And when the time the credits come up with in memoriam to the Brandon Lee, it's a tearjerk. But at the same time, this one is one that really did set the tone. Before this one, I can think of maybe Darkman and Batman that really did push the limits of the superhero genre. And this is one that really did double down with a new director and a couple of new writers. And this is one that really does add to kind of the foundation of where we went after. So this one, again, not an excellent movie, but at the same time, this one is a good movie for the experience.
I agree, and I'm always going to be on the fence of whether or not this film is iconic for what happened to it and if it really is just a piece of its time. Because I will watch this movie any time of day. I love this movie. I mean, I've watched it 3 times since we announced that we were doing it, just because I'm watching it already, and now I'm just watching with an extra close eye. But it is an experience, and it is a callback to people that saw it and experienced it for the first time when it was relevant, right? And that to me is like the biggest importance. It's like, I don't think younger generations are going to understand the importance of Nirvana or Smashing Pumpkins or early Metallica the way that people that grew up in it did. I feel like this movie is the embodiment of that on screen, right? They're going to be making Jurassic Park movies for the rest of time, right? It just is what it is. That's one of the things that's just going to keep getting rebooted and remade over and over again. But they made a handful of Crow sequels and a remake, and none of them are good. And that's where I think this movie does have its pitfalls, is because it was such an iconic and relevant icon of its time, of its decade, that it cannot be recreated, and it should not be recreated because it has a very specific timestamp that's only important to a group of people within a 20-year lifespan, right? Like that 20-year period, those are the people that love it. And then after that, I really don't think people give a shit.
I will push back that Salvation wasn't that bad. It was bad, but not, it was watchable.
Yeah, but it wasn't theater worthy.
Oh, hell no. None of
Obviously,
them were
it was-
theater worthy. Hell no. But I will take that over the remake any day.
No, agreed. I'll take over the what's it, Edward Furlong one with, oh, never mind. It's gross. I think Tara Reid's in that one too. Ugh. Okay, so let's talk about scores now. I feel like I'm in a rut lately because all of Gene's critiques have been rough for me, and I've given him some cookies lately where, hey, he didn't hate the movie, he just didn't like it enough to defend it and blah, blah. So I've been giving him like D's and C's. I don't want to give him an F on this one because I know that at the end of the day, he just didn't get it. But I think he should have been prepared with his debate more for the conversation, especially if Roger liked it so much. So because of the unpreparedness and not really being able to give a better answer than it's a typical revenge film and it rains a lot, I'm going to give him a D.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And when it comes to Roger, this is, again, what I appreciate is he knows what it is and he will call it for what it is. And there's no fluff to it. So he said the key words is an experience. That's exactly what it is. And he tied that into the Brandon Lee death. He talked about what made the experience so good. And he had a ton of valid points to push against Gene that Gene didn't really have anything to counteract because he really had nothing on this movie. And again, it's not a great movie, a good movie, but the review was spot on. So I would give Ebert, honestly, a 3.5 star on this one because I think he was on point with where superhero movies are, where they were going, and he used the exact keywords to describe what this movie is.
Yeah, and he's been playing really well in our last several episodes where he really is hitting the nail on the head. And with this one, like I said, he is embracing the change in the production of movies. He's embracing the change in what audiences are receptive to and what filmmakers are trying to do. Let's not forget that like we are in the 1990s now where music video directors had a whole decade where they essentially took over and gave us directors like Fincher and Michael Bay and Proyas. Music video directors abound, right? And a lot of them are still working, and some of them kind of fizzled out at the end of the 90s and then went back to music videos, if they even make music videos anymore. So this is an era where visually stunning films really became the new norm. And Roger was ready for it. And this was a film that I think helped springboard him into wanting more of these visuals from these directors. Okay, so now that we are in the dark and mysterious era of our films right now, winding up until our holiday season, we're going to bring the light and fluffy. We got a couple more dark ones. And I am bringing next week Mike Nichols' horror film. I know it sounds weird. Wolf, starring Jack Nicholson, Michelle Pfeiffer, and James Spader. It's going to be like our last little dark film before we jump into our holiday movies. Then we're going to go through Thanksgiving and Christmas and lead up to our New Year's special. So yes, The Crow and Wolf. That's a good double feature. I'd watch that.
100%. I mean, I haven't watched Wolf in a while. This is going to be a fantastic revisit. I can't wait for that one.
Right. And the jokes are gonna fly because Jack Nicholson is a werewolf. I mean, it's gonna be a great conversation. So anyway, one quick announcement that I have to put out there. Justin doesn't even know about this yet. I just got the news today. So the network that we belong to, Deluxe Edition Network, has officially folded. It got sunsetted today. The people that were in charge of it have gone separate ways. And so the network is folding. So we're in search for a new network. I got a couple people that have reached out to us right now. So I just want people to know that if you are using our Bulletproof Coffee code, it probably won't work after the next couple weeks. So maybe get in there now and get your last little orders in using that B2B code. But this will be the last episode under the Deluxe Edition Network banner. Actually, no, it's already done. So by the time we're recording this, we've already had a few episodes come out that we're not part of the network anymore, but this is the first day that we're recording where I officially have that news. So thank you, Deluxe Edition Network, for having us for the last year and having my other show on there for the last couple of years. It was a great time. You're very supportive. I'm sorry it fell apart, but we will move on, hopefully to another network very soon. And with that, you know what to do. Please like, review, rate, subscribe, leave us 5 stars, and check out my other show, The Cult-Worthy Cinema Podcast. You can find me at thecultworthy.com, and you can find my co-host Justin over at
TheMovieWire.com.
We will see you next week.
See you next week.